Back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm glad to have with me once again Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And before I say hello to Daniel, I'd like to just suggest to you that you go to ronpaulinstitute.org, ronpaulinstitute.org, to avail yourself to many great articles on the Middle East and on geopolitics in general, what's going on with the United States and NATO and all of that, and lots of contrarian ideas there for sure. So if you want to check out and maybe avail yourself to some different opinions from those that you hear every day, day in, day out on the mainstream media, do yourself a favor. If you're interested in truth and different ideas, at least different opinions, go to ronpaulinstitute.org. Thanks for joining me again, Daniel. It's really great to have you with me.
Oh, it's great to talk to you again, Jay. Thanks for having me on.
Always good to talk to you, Daniel. You know, I just finished saying in my introduction that I think perhaps there's more than meets the eye. Perhaps it isn't just Shia and Sunni or Christians and Muslims and Jews and Muslims going at each other, but maybe there's something bigger going on. Maybe it has something to do with the United States as a superpower, as virtually the lone superpower now. You know, certainly more than a republic, we are certainly an empire. That might have more to do with our meddling in the Middle East. And I'm suggesting that it even has to do with the petrodollar and the ability of the United States to continue to own the world's reserve currency. It benefits us as a superpower very well that way, at least the military-industrial complex. We can continue financing ourselves by creating money out of nothing, using that then to expand the empire. Do you think this is a viable viewpoint that I have, Daniel, or am I crazy?
No, Jay, I think you have a very good point. You know, and the thing about your religious identity, whether you identify as you point out as Christian or Jew, but particularly within Islam, if you identify as a Shia or a Sunni, these are very, very strongly held emotional positions. You know, religion by its nature is sort of not logical in the sort of the normal sense of things. You know, you hold your view as your faith. And so they're very, very powerful things that you identify with. And so if outside powers can manipulate, can pit one group against another.
We're having some technical difficulties. I guess Daniel, we lost him somehow. He's there in Texas, perhaps in the middle of the storms they're having down there. Hopefully Daniel will be right back with us. But you know, the whole issue of the minority in of the Sunnis versus the Shia, and one of the things that I want to ask Daniel about, if we get him back on, we have the Persian Gulf. To the west, we have Saudi Arabia, which is a Sunni country, and the Sunnis are the majority of Muslims. I think something like, 80-85% of the Muslims are Sunnis. And then we have the Shias, who are the minorities, but they are the majority in Iran. And as Daniel was telling me before we got started here, they're about 53% of Iraq is Shia as well. And it's interesting because those three major oil-producing countries that surround the Persian Gulf. On the north, you have Iran, which of course we've been at odds with for some time now, arguably back to 1953 when the Shah of Iran was put in power by our CIA after we overthrew the elected government of Iran, and we put in we put in the Shah of Iran, who allowed British Petroleum to get its access to Iranian oil. And you know, we've had John Perkins on this show, who has talked many different times about how we have used our CIA and our NGOs to go into foreign governments, foment problems, and overthrow governments. And so this is something that we've been doing most recently in the Ukraine with Victoria Nuland and probably George Soros NGO undermining and financing that overthrow of the people's desire to have the elected government. And so the United States doesn't like the elected government. It overthrows it. It uses NGOs to overthrow the government, to foment trouble in these countries. And this is something we've been doing for a long time, and we continue to be involved in the Middle East. I don't know if we can get Daniel. Is Daniel back on?
I am back, Jay. I'm very sorry that the call dropped.
Good.
I'm
Okay,
with you.
Okay, Daniel. We lost you there. You started your thoughts on. You were saying about the the emotions that are attached to religion, and maybe you want to pick up there.
Sure, and I think because they can be, to the secular world, they can be irrational, and therefore I think they can be easily manipulated. And I'm sure that intelligence agencies throughout the world understand this, and that's why you'll often see interviews with people saying, I had no idea my neighbor was Sunni and Shia before any of this stuff blew up. Particularly in Syria, which is secular, people didn't really pay attention to these sorts of things. So if you can get people riled up on those deep emotional levels, then they can really be manipulated into doing a number of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, it just strikes me that it seems as though in this battle in the Middle East, that Russia has gained some prominence at the expense of the United States. Would you agree with that?
I think Russia has asserted itself internationally or regionally in a way that it had not done really since the end of the Cold War. And if you look at the genesis of what happens in Russia's involvement in Syria in particular, starting in September, President Putin made it very clear in a speech to the UN that they had had enough of the way the U.S. was behaving in Syria. They'd had enough with the U.S. directly and indirectly funding, financing, and supporting radical Islam in Syria with the hope of overthrowing the secular government. And he essentially said, we've had it, we've had enough. We've been asked by the Syrian government, the legitimate government of Syria, on a bilateral basis to assist them. We've accepted that request. So I think they were back up against the wall, looking at potentially thousands of extremist fighters from Russian territory who had gone into Syria, of these people coming home and causing all sorts of problems. The Russians have been through this a couple of times with Chechnya wars, and they were facing something that could be very serious. And so they acted, and by acting decisively and doing in a couple of months what the U.S.-led coalition had not been able to do in an entire year, which is to seriously degrade ISIS and to allow the rollback of ISIS. To have that done, I think, has increased Russia's stature in the world and increased the importance of a separate pole that's developing, and you see Russia, Iran, China, and others that are gravitating toward this separate pole.
Yeah, towards even separate markets and separate banking systems and so forth. Trade systems and so forth. Right? Not just military, but also some other commercial relationships that have been strengthened. Yeah, as a result.
Absolutely, trade pipelines, trading. This is somewhat unrelated. I noticed with some interest that Zimbabwe has adopted the Chinese currency as its official currency. So
yeah, I saw that.
Something that would be unheard of in the past. So the rest of the world is irritated. As you point out, the U.S. has been behaving as if it has an empire. And as Dr. Paul always says, do what we say and we'll fund you, cross us and we'll bomb you. Well, I think more and more countries are starting to want option C, which is looking elsewhere and being left alone. So I think, you're absolutely correct, Chet.
So the BRICS and the countries, let's say China and Russia at least, and some of those that you named, Iran and others, are offering a third alternative, an option C, rather than just an A or a B. And so what we have, it seems to me, Daniel, and I saw some time ago, there was this map that was drawn. It was on a U.S. military website that subsequently was taken down. And it showed a redrawing of the map of the Middle East that essentially had all three countries combined, that is around the Persian Gulf. It had Iran in the north, Iraq to the east, and Saudi Arabia, of course, which is the United States' primary ally there in the oil world, to the west, and combining them into one nation. And that map was subsequently pulled down off of the U.S. armed website. It was really an interesting thing to me, but as I see what's happening now, would you agree that Iraq has maybe moved closer to Russia in recent months than it had been? For example, it allowed Russia to fly over its territory, I believe, to fly some weapons into Syria. But is that that's the sense that I get, that Iraq has possibly moved more towards the Russian camp and away from the U.S. camp?
I think that's a fair assessment, and I think part of it, and I've seen many credible articles written recently that talk about the frustration in Iraq over the seemingly incompetent U.S. Fight against ISIS. They see the Iranian militias in going into Iraq and being much more effective in taking out ISIS than the U.S. For whatever reason, some say it's on purpose. The U.S. doesn't want to destroy ISIS because it needs ISIS to take out Assad, or the U.S. is. If the U.S. is that incompetent, then we have to ask ourselves why we're spending $700 billion a year on a military that can't defeat this. But the Iraqis are frustrated. They're also tired of being pushed around. If you remember, the U.S. military pulled out of Iraq because Iraq wouldn't sign a forces agreement giving immunity to American troops. So there has been some talk that the Iraqis are looking to the Russians to help them fight ISIS, and I think a couple of members of Parliament have mentioned that. But whenever that happens, the U.S. will come and strong arm the Iraqis into getting back in shape. So how long will their arms be twisted before they break? It's a great question. I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have time to pursue it any further or other questions that I wanted to ask you, Daniel, because we are basically out of time here. I do want to thank you for coming on my show again. We'll have to have you on more often and have you on my website at JTaylor Media as well so we can pursue some of these very complicated questions, but I think very important issues that Americans should be somewhat more knowledgeable about before they pull the lever at the voting booths next November, whenever the next election's coming up in November. So, Daniel, thanks for being with me so much again today. Thank you so much for being with me, and we'll look forward to doing it again sometime in the near future.
Thanks, Jay.